Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson, and today our look at the glimpses of the supernatural through the figures of the book of Genesis brings us to Enoch. Like Abel, there's almost nothing written about Enoch in the Old Testament, except for the fact that he walked with God. However, in Second Temple literature, written between the 2nd to 1st century BC, Enoch looms large in the apocalyptic literature of the time, the literature devoted to looking at God's ultimate judgment on the people of earth. This book, commonly called First Enoch, is an important bit of background for the New Testament, as Jude quotes it and 2 Peter cites details that come from it. In this lesson, we're going to look at the biblical roots of the person of Enoch, what we can know for sure from inspired scripture. But we will also talk about how the book of Enoch gives important background information to the mentality of Jews in the first century to explain those references to it in the New Testament. Thank you for joining me today as we look at the figure of Enoch, who we first meet in Genesis chapter 5. There is no Old Testament figure as surrounded by the supernatural as Enoch. And yet, there could be an unofficial Disney-esque theme song, "We Don't Talk About Enoch," in the church. When it was the last time that you heard a sermon on Enoch. And one reason for that is because just about any area of biblical or Christian studies, when you bring up Enoch, things start to get a little unraveled. Whether we're talking theology or textual criticism or canonicity of the scriptures, which ones should be in and which ones out. As soon as you bring up Enoch, you start opening cans of worms that are, in some cases, impossible to close. And so Enoch doesn't get a lot of press. There is a book of Enoch. We're going to talk about that because it's so critical. And that is why, one reason why Enoch is so prominent when it comes to supernatural discussions, but also controversial when it comes to discussing things. That book is like a hidden monkey wrench or trap that is in the Bible, and that's why people walk around it. But we are going to start with what is well-known and documented and definitive about Enoch from the scriptures that we can say these are the inspired word. And then we will move on to some of the things that are a little bit more speculative and controversial and things that we really have to take with some caution, perhaps. But we're going to start with the definite ones. And I'm actually going to introduce Enoch not from his narrative in Genesis, but from First Chronicles. First, the chronicler whoever wrote First Chronicles, some say it might have been Ezra, we don't know for who. Whoever wrote it did us a little favor by streamlining the genealogy right at the first of his book. Of course, it's also one reason why people start with Chronicles and then stop with Chronicles is because he starts with a genealogy. It's like Matthew. It's like, okay, I want some story here, I'm getting a list of names. And the Chronicles list of names goes on for a while, but luckily we are going to stop at verse 4. His list of names cuts to the chase. First Chronicles chapter 1, 1 through 4. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So we see Enoch in the list. We see his relationship to Adam and to Noah, and we see him there in the middle. Interestingly, his name isn't in Hebrew, it doesn't start with an E, it starts with an H sound. Just kind of like we saw with Abel, his name in Hebrew is Abel, starts with an H. Well, Enoch's name in Hebrew is Enoch. It starts actually with a Ch sound, Enoch. And his name means set apart, as in dedicated by some sort of ceremonial act is usually the implication, being dedicated to something. Not like I am dedicated in my earnestness, but I have been set apart, dedicated for a purpose. No big fuss about his name is made in the scriptures like that it was about Noah or even about Abel or about Cain or Seth. But that's what his name means. In fact, interestingly enough, Enoch is the root of that is the same as our root of Hanukkah or Hanukkah. We don't normally say the way it's pronounced in Hebrew. Hanukkah is actually built around the same name. It's called the Feast of Dedication, is one other word for it, and that's what Hanukkah means, a dedication, and Enoch's name is related to that. And, we can see if we read the story about Enoch, why he might be called dedicated, because of what happens with his walk with God. And in discussing the walk with God, Enoch's walk with God, we are on solid biblical territory. Enoch was a man of apparently extraordinary faithfulness in his walk with God. And that's where we will dip into Genesis chapter 5, verses 21 through 24, which gives us Enoch's story. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he had fathered Methuselah 300 years, and fathered sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was no more, for God took him. Enoch is the only one in the whole list of Genesis 5 who is not said to die. It says he walked with God. That's all it says. It doesn't even explicitly say that he was taken to heaven. It just says he walked with God, and then he wasn't there anymore because God took him. And that's the mystery of Enoch. And also nobody else in the book of Genesis of 5, in chapter 5, specifically, is said to have walked with God. It just says they lived for X number of years, then they had kids, then they lived X number of more years, and then they died. That's a very repeated concept here, except for Enoch, who didn't just live, he walked with God. And didn't die, God took him. That's what we know about Enoch. Even that opens up some theological worms if you think about it too much. But the Hebrew writer saw Enoch and wasn't afraid to talk about him, at least a little bit. He makes the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, in verses 5 and 6. The Hebrew writer says, "By faith Enoch was taken up, so that he did not experience death, and he was not found, because God took him up. For before his removal, he had been approved as having been pleasing to God. Now without faith, it's impossible to please him, for the one who approaches God must believe that he exists, and is a rewarder for those who seek him." We get a little more detail from the writer of Hebrews, who just really elaborates a little bit on what we read in Genesis, and that is that he was taken up because he had faith. It's kind of the logical inference that Genesis puts out there, but doesn't draw the conclusion for you. But the Hebrew writer does draw the conclusion and write it in his, that the reason Enoch was taken and why he is said to be walking with God is because he had faith. He also uses this moment in his hall of faith in Hebrews 11 to define basically what faith is. Believing that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Not just that he exists. It's not enough to just think God exists. That's not quite faith. But trusting that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. I would paraphrase that as saying he keeps his promises. If we believe that he is there and that he keeps his promises, then we have faith. The phrase, "the one who approaches God must believe that he exists," is interesting because I think it's pointing to more than just existence per se. That phrase, "he exists," is a form of the same phrase used back in Exodus when God is telling Moses who he is. And when in English we translate the Hebrew as "I am." Well, in the Septuagint, the Greek version of that story, when God tells Moses his name, it's "I exist." It's the same verb used here to say that the one who approaches God must believe he exists. So I think that the Hebrew writer is implying that what we really need to have faith is not just that God exists, but that he is the I am. He is the God of Scripture revealed in the Old Testament to us. That is the God who exists. And not just that a God exists, but that the scriptural God of Israel exists, and that we have to have faith in him. That's faith. So he did not experience death. That is also explicit here. It's kind of implied in the idea that God took him. But here, Hebrew writer says, no, he didn't even experience death. He was translated, is one word that's used for his experience, taken from here to somewhere else by divine act. When I think about this, I think about what we read in First Corinthians when it talks about when Jesus comes back, we don't all have to die to be immortal, to put on incorruptibility, that when Jesus returns, we will all be changed into that incorruptible status without having to go through death. That seems to be what happened to Enoch. He did not have to die in order to be conferred the kind of immortal existence that we will all share at Christ's return, when those who have faith in God will have at the resurrection. Well, that much is what we can say for certain about Enoch. Not a whole lot, except he had faith in his life, and he was taken without death. But there is another element of Enoch in Scripture. Enoch's prophecy, we'll call it. And this only appears in Scripture in one place, and that's in the book of Jude. In Jude, verse 14 and 15, and Enoch, the seventh from Adam, also prophesied about these people being the false teachers that Jude is writing against, saying, Behold, the Lord came with tens of thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment against all, and to convict all the ungodly concerning all their ungodly deeds that they have committed in an ungodly way, and concerning all the harsh things that ungodly sinners had spoken about against him. So I wonder how Jude feels about these false teachers. Maybe he thinks they're ungodly, since he uses the word like 4 times. And he doesn't personally use the word. He's quoting Enoch to describe these people. And I don't know if you were paying attention, but there is no such phrase in Genesis when it talks about Enoch. He didn't say this in Genesis chapter 5, and he doesn't say it anywhere else in the revealed scriptures that we have. This quote isn't in the scriptures, and yet it's clearly talking about this Enoch and not some other Enoch that might have been around, because he says explicitly the seventh from Adam. So he's clearly talking about the Enoch that we just read about in chapter 5, who did not experience death and walked with God. And yet we can't find this complete phrase. So was Jude merely inspired? In other words, God revealed to him that this is what Enoch said without Jude having a source? It just came to Jude's head from God's inspiration, and that he wrote it? I mean, that some people might say so. But some time ago, people discovered that book with Enoch's name on it. And when we look in that book at the first chapter, it's been chapterified and versified by scholars since they discovered the book. And in First Enoch chapter 1, verse 9, we read, Look, he comes with the myriads of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to destroy all the wicked and to convict all humanity for all the wicked deeds that they have done and the proud and hard words that the wicked sinners spoke against him. Substituted ungodly for wicked, you perhaps would hear the echoes even closer. And the word myriad, translated here myriads of his holy ones, is the same Greek word that means 10,000. So when it talks about his 10,000s of angels, it's the same as the myriads of holy ones, very close match there. So with some only subtle changes to the wording, this verse from the book called First Enoch is exactly what Jude is quoting. And this is why we get into quandaries a little bit, because Jude, an accepted canonical book, clearly is practically verbatim quoting First Enoch, a non-canonical pseudepigraphical book. In other words, I don't believe that anyone who is a scholar, who spends time thinking about these texts, would think that the actual biblical Enoch from Genesis 5 wrote this book. The earliest that it is ascribed to is sometime 100 to possibly up as long as 300 BC. Probably familiar with the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which come from Qumran, and some of those Dead Sea Scrolls were assumed to be written by the people of Qumran in their community, a kind of monastery or monastic community of Jews in the first century. And they wrote actual interpretations of the book of First Enoch. One of the reasons why we know that First Enoch was around in the first century is because of these Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found with the passages from Enoch and commentary about Enoch, the book, by these Jewish scribes and theologians, we'll call them, because they're really doing theology. They're thinking about how do we take these biblical texts and understand them. First Enoch was highly enough regarded by these Jews, serious, dedicated Jewish thinkers, to treat it as if it were Scripture, alongside with interpretations of Daniel or Malachi or Isaiah or any of these other Old Testament passages. So yes, in the days of Jude, there was no official textbook. You couldn't just go to the local store and buy a Bible and these are the books and that's it. Yeah, Jude quotes it, apparently giving it some sense of authority. And that's one of those questions of canonicity. Well, if Jude quotes it, should it be in the Bible too? That's the question. And the canonicity of Jude and the canonicity of First Enoch get all entangled together because of this dependence. And it's clear that 2 Peter also uses some references to First Enoch. Historically, there's been only one Christian tradition that has kept Enoch in their canon, and that is the Ethiopian church. For many centuries, the only copy of Enoch that was the one in the Ethiopian church's Bible. The reason that only the Ethiopian had it is that their version was in the native Ethiopian language called Ge'ez. This was a language from the ancient world. Scholars weren't sure that it really was ancient. They thought it might be medieval. They didn't have anything older than this Ethiopian version of the book. It was talked about in some things, like Jerome talks about it, Tertullian talks about it, but who knew that this version in Ethiopian would have been the same thing they were talking about, because somebody could just write anything and call it the Book of Enoch, and that happens in the Middle Ages. But then, when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls were these commentaries on First Enoch, and long passages were quoted in these commentaries, and they matched up more or less exactly with what was in the Ethiopian First Enoch version, then scholars were like, okay, maybe there's something there. And they started to investigate, and pretty much almost everything that is in the Ethiopian Enoch is considered ancient, pre-Christian, like 100 or 200 BC, and has been accepted as an important document from the ancient world. But the Ge'ez version in Ethiopian still remains the only complete copy, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are fragmentary in so many places. First Enoch is called by the scholars apocalyptic literature because it does give these glimpses of God's unfolding plan and his ultimate end of that plan, what we might call eschatology, what God is going to do in the end, and it definitely has elements of that end times view. Now, I don't think Enoch, the first Enoch, and I'm going to probably say Enoch and I'm referring to the book mainly, not to the guy from chapter 5 of Genesis, because his name is used. And yes, the book of First Enoch is written in big chunks of it in first person, as if the Enoch of chapter 5 is talking. about what he experienced. That's why it's called the Book of Enoch, because it's first about him, and also a lot of what he is supposedly had saying in his writings. I don't think it was Enoch himself who wrote these things, but I think what we get to are some background information for how the Jewish world in the days of Jesus thought about things. I believe First Enoch gives us answers to questions that are unanswerable from the biblical text alone. If we only had the Bible, we could not answer certain questions definitively. But the answers that come from First Enoch should not be considered Scripture. They are background information, not Scripture. They do often help, though, to make sense of perplexing Bible passages. So when First Enoch suggests an answer to a question that we have about the text, we can say, certainly, this is how a first century Jew would answer that question. Now, how much weight do we put behind that? Sometimes perhaps a lot, because the New Testament writers seem to be thinking in the same general vein as their Jewish brothers about certain things. Other things, maybe we don't put so much weight behind, because it's not Scripture. It's just the writing of someone in that time frame. But we do that with other resources too. There are several writers that wrote about things that touch on biblical topics that we use to reinforce our understanding of the Scriptures. Philo is one of these. He was a first century philosopher, trained in both the Scriptures and in Hellenistic philosophy, like Platonism, and Aristotle, and that sort of thing. And he is certainly an imbiber of that Greco-philosophical ideas, but also highly steeped in Scripture. And he is a contemporary of Jesus, nearly, in that first century. So what he says, we think, okay, well, this is what a Jewish man said about these thoughts. Josephus, also a Jewish man of the first century, a historian, a little bit later than Philo and a little bit later than Jesus, because he writes a lot about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. But still first century, and he's writing these things. And so he writes about the Pharisees, and he writes about the Sadducees, and he writes about the Essenes, which we don't learn about at all from the New Testament. But Josephus gives us a new perspective on the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and some of the things that we see Josephus talking about help us understand why Jesus interacted with the Pharisees the way he did, because of Josephus makes those clear. And First Enoch is in that same vein. It is a writing from the first century. Now we don't know the name of the writer, like we do with Philo and Josephus in their books, but it's still coming from the first century and explaining a theological point of view about certain things that are going on in the Bible. And so I believe it's as helpful, at least, as Philo, as Josephus, in understanding biblical concepts. Much of the material in First Enoch is before the first century, but it was highly influential during the first century and would be how a Jew would answer the questions, biblical questions, in the first century. And then the Mishnah and the Talmud is also a useful resource, but I put it in a kind of a second-hand class because it was actually not even compiled until at least the second century, and even later. But it's a memorial record of what the Jews were trying to capture and retain in their corporate memories about that second temple period before the temple was destroyed. So they're trying to capture that older concept. And so it's helpful as well. Perhaps not as directly first century as Philo, Josephus, First Enoch, and a few others, like the Book of Jubilees and some other things that we have from the first century that are copies of older material, but that were in view in that first century. So let's just, I've kind of organized these things in a sense of Q&A, because what are the questions that Enoch answers that we can't get answers to any other way? Well, one of them is, why was Enoch taken without experiencing death? Now, the Hebrew writer does give us the idea of faithfulness, but other people have been faithful. I mean, how can we doubt that Abraham was faithful? Yes, he had failings, but If he was taken, did he sin? Well, yes, because the only sinless person has ever been Jesus. So we know Enoch sinned, even though he walked with God in faith. He had 365 years of life on this earth. And somewhere in those 365, I'm sure he sinned. But he did walk in faith. But what is the answer that Enoch gives us to this question? Well, Enoch's answer is that God had a special task for Enoch in the heavenly realms. So he brings Enoch to the heavenly realms so that he can accomplish this task. Now, that comes from First Enoch chapter 12 in verses 1 and 2. Enoch's already been giving some background information about Genesis 6 and the flood and other things. But in chapter 12, he sort of backpedals and says, well, before all of that stuff happened, before these things, Enoch was taken. And no human being knew where he had been taken or where he was or what happened to him. His works were with the watchers, and with the holy ones were his days. So after basically recapitulating what we learned from Genesis 5 about his being taken, he then says he had work to do with the watchers. The watchers is a term used frequently in Enoch for angels or angelic-style beings, members of what we've come to call the divine council through some of the earlier teachings that we've walked through. And so basically God had a task for Enoch to do amongst those watchers, those divine beings. And so that's why he brought him to heaven, to the heavenly realm, was to do this task. Interestingly enough, and we'll see this as some of the other answers unfold, Enoch was to be for these watchers what the angelic divine beings are normally doing with people. Because normally God has a message for someone on earth, whether it's Mary, you're going to have a child, or it could be Daniel, what do these visions mean, or whatever. God sends an angel to the person and says, here's the message from God about what you're experiencing. And so God sends an angelic divine being to the person in order to communicate with them. Well, for Enoch, what we learn from the story generally is that God sent a human to some of these watchers to tell them a message from God. So it's interesting that Enoch, a human, functions as God's messenger to the divine beings in the same way that divine beings serve as messengers to humans. So another question in Genesis 6, verse 2, who are the sons of God who took wives from among the daughters of men, or Adam, daughters of Adam? Well, if we go strictly from what we know in Scripture and from Genesis chapter 6, we really don't have a definitive answer to that question. The sons of God have been interpreted as human leaders, as like kings, because they were sometimes equated with divine power in the ancient worlds. A very common interpretation is that the sons of God were the descendants of Seth, who were faithful, unlike the descendants of Cain, who were not. And so sons of God is sometimes identified with Seth. But First Enoch gives us a very definite answer about this question. So if we want to know how a first century Jew would answer the question, the answer is they were angelic beings in heaven who rebelled against God's design in order to take wives amongst humans. And so that's sort of the continuation of what God's call to Enoch is in chapter 12, verses 3 and 5. And this is with Enoch presumably speaking for himself. I, Enoch, was standing blessing the Lord of majesty, the King of the ages, and look, the watchers of the great Holy One called me, Enoch the scribe, and said to me, Enoch, righteous scribe, go and say to the watchers of heaven, who forsook the highest heaven and the sanctuary of their eternal station, and defiled themselves with women, as the sons of earth do, so they did, and took wives for themselves, and they worked great desolation on the earth. And finally gets around to what he's supposed to say to them. You will have no peace or forgiveness. So that's the message initially that Enoch is supposed to take to these rebellious watchers. You're not going to have any peace or forgiveness for what they did in those days before the flood. Then the question is, what is the connection between the sons of God, the Nephilim, and the flood of Noah? In other words, why does chapter 6 start so oddly with this story about the sons of God and the Nephilim, and then immediately turn around and tell us about Noah? Is it just stuck here for no reason? Is there some connection between these stories? Because the narrative of Genesis does not make a connection between them. It just tells us one story, and then it starts the story of Noah. Well, according to the First Enoch story, yes, these are very much connected events. The actions of the sons of God in their marrying and having these Nephilim children led directly to the violence among humanity that spurred God's reaction by sending the flood. So this is definitely a cause and effect relationship, a relationship that is not clear from Genesis 6 alone, but which is clear in Enoch. In chapter 9, verses 8 and 10, we read, "They have gone into the daughters of the men of earth." The they there are those rebellious heavenly beings. "They have gone into the daughters of men on earth, and they have lain with them. They have defiled themselves with the women. And they have revealed to them all sins, and have taught them to make hate-inducing charms. And now look, the daughters of men have borne sons from them, giants, half-breeds, and the blood of men is shed on the earth, and the whole earth is filled with iniquity. And look, the spirits of the souls of the men who have died make suit, and their groan has come up to the gates of heaven, and it does not cease to come forth from the presence of the iniquities that have come upon the earth." So even this only sort of implies the violence, but the whole story of Enoch explicitly says in another place that the Nephilim themselves are doing violence against men. These children of the Watchers are killing people and being violent against humanity and spurring humans to kill each other as well. And so this whole violence is a part of what the Watchers taught that they shouldn't have been teaching to humanity, and the fact that their children, these Nephilim, were violent by nature and stirring up violence. And I like the idea of here that the spirits of the souls of the men are making suit. In other words, this is another act like Abel, whose blood was crying out against Cain for having killed him. This pictures the blood of the dead crying out to God for the violence of the earth. And so God is not somewhat arbitrarily responding to the violence. He's responding to the pleas of those who have died to act on their behalf and to render judgment against their killers. And so God is responding in that way, in which case it sort of fits a pattern of Scripture that we see in other places. Cain with Abel's blood crying out against him, with the Israelites crying out against their enslavers in Egypt. We see that God is responding to the outcry of those who have been wronged. And that is why he decides to flood the earth, is as a response to the outcry. One place in Enoch describes the earth as practically empty of life because of all of this killing and the violence. It's kind of become a recent popular thing to depict God's flood as an act of violence against people, because so many people would have died in the flood. And so how could God be humane by killing all these people, men, women, and children alike? But Enoch, this ancient document, suggests that most of the people on earth were already dead because of the violence, that this was emptying the earth because of it. And if God had allowed it to just continue unabated and without intervention, eventually everybody would be dead because everybody of the violence that was going on amongst them. I mean, I guess they couldn't kill absolutely everybody. Somebody had to do the last killing, but there would still be just only death on the earth. The flood is not creating more death. It's actually preventing the death that would eventually have happened. That would have been worse if God had not intervened. So other questions that this brings up. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, it mentions the angels who sinned. Why would 2 Peter 2:4 bring up the angels who sinned in the context of false teachers specifically? First Enoch says the sin of the sons of God was as much about destructive teaching as it was about illicit procreation. It wasn't just about them marrying these women and having kids with them when they shouldn't. It was about what they were teaching the people. We already saw that briefly with that earlier passage. They were teaching them about hate-inducing charms and about these other things. Well, in Enoch chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, it sort of gives us a list of some of the worst things that one of these rebellious watchers named Abel was teaching. Abel taught men to make swords of iron and weapons and shields and breastplates of every instrument of war. He showed them metals on the earth and how they should work gold to fashion it suitably, and concerning silver to fashion it for bracelets and ornaments for women. And he showed them concerning antimony and eye paint and all manner of precious stones and dyes. And the sons of men made them for themselves and for their daughters. And there was much godlessness on the earth, and they made their ways desolate. Well, what are the two things that seem to always come up as the worst things that we could do? Our worst sins: sex and violence. And this is basically accusing the watchers, and this Abel particularly, for teaching us how to indulge in sex and violence in greater and greater ways. By seductive acts for women through makeup and these other bangles, the bracelets, making them more seductive and therefore tempting us more to sex, illicit sex, and violence with weapons of war and implements of destruction. And so that is what these watchers did. Not so much, we humans fully capable of sex and violence on our own. What the watchers did, according to the Enoch story, is make that worse by giving us the tools to amplify the destruction. 2 Peter 2 and Jude 6 both describe the angels being bound in for judgment. We wouldn't know why that was the case if we didn't have Enoch that describes the rebel angels being bound until the judgment day, where they will eventually be thrown into a fiery abyss, from First Enoch chapter 10, verses 11 to 13. And here we get into some of that overlap between Noah's event and the final judgment event. In Enoch 10, to Michael he said, "Go, Michael, bind Shemihazah and the others with him, who have mated with the daughters of men, so that they were defiled by them in their uncleanness. And when their sons perish, and they see the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, until the day of their judgment and consummation, until the everlasting judgment is consummated. Then they will be led away to the fiery abyss, and to the torture, and to the prison, where they will be confined forever." So there's a two-phase process. A phase first, go and bind them, and he tells Michael to do this. The one angel that we actually have some biblical evidence for, Michael as well. But he says, Michael, go to Shemihazah, who's supposedly the ringleader, who gets all the angels, rebellious angels together, and binds them. But he binds them for a while, for 70 generations, and then there will be a final and ultimate judgment that occurs when they will be thrown into this fiery abyss. So both Peter and Jude seem to have this picture in mind when they're discussing the angels being bound. Also, I think there could be something behind Jesus and the legion, when legion is pleading with Jesus about being thrown out, and Jesus ultimately he casts them into the pigs. But legion says, "Don't throw us into the abyss." And that's kind of a mystery. But here in Enoch, that word abyss always stands for that fiery lake of ultimate judgment, out of which no one comes. Once you're in the fiery lake, you don't get out. And so that's one reason why those demons were saying, "Don't throw us into the abyss." Jesus grants that, oddly enough. And the last thing I want to bring out from here to wrap up is a picture of what is the scriptural hope for eternity. Because often we view this as a heaven-only existence, where we exist in heaven. Earth is completely and ultimately destroyed. There is no physical existence anymore. It's only a spiritual existence. But people have been saying that's not really the Jewish view. That's, in a Jewish view, is that heaven and earth are rejoined together, and that becomes a new Eden picture. Not that earth is completely destroyed, but that heaven and earth overlap. Well, Enoch definitely goes for the second picture of heaven and earth being joined together and it being a perfect existence. In First Enoch chapter 2, verse 20 through chapter 11, verse 2, which is only a couple of verses, it gives this picture of what life will be like in that eternal blessed state. Cleanse the earth from all impurity and from all wrong and from all lawlessness and from all sin and godlessness and impurities that have come upon the earth. Remove. And all the sons of men will become righteous, and all the peoples will worship me, and all will bless me and prostrate themselves, and all the earth will be cleansed from all defilement and from all uncleanness, and I shall not again send upon them any wrath or scourge for all the generations of eternity. Then I shall open the storehouses of blessing that are in heaven, and make them descend upon the earth, and upon the works and the labor of the sons of men, and then truth and peace will be united together for all the days of eternity and for all the generations of humanity. This is just one brief passage, and there are several like this in the book of Enoch that picture that ultimate blessed state of what we will be like who follow God. I think that it could be argued that these images are one reason, first, that Enoch was so popular in the first century, is because it gave these pictures of that eternal blessing. And two, one reason why the New Testament writers found affinity with the book of Enoch, Peter and Jude particularly, is because what we read about in Enoch as that ultimate blessing is what Jesus was promising and what he was fulfilling. And they saw that these things were so close together with the kingdom that Jesus proclaimed, and the descriptions that Enoch gives of that future kingdom were so incompatible with one another that they gravitated to this book, despite the fact that it was not even in the Jewish canon per se, but it gives that same sort of Christian picture of eternal blessing.
Thanks again for joining me today as we look at Enoch and the glimpses of the supernatural we can see from these figures in the book of Genesis. I look forward to seeing you again next time as we continue to examine the treasures in the biblical text.